Fesca má raibh, agus fáilte go leabhar le náisiúnta na halba agus an órid seo. Is mise Annette Hagan, agus hamia gobar an neach cúram, an a leorichin as tearg agus as luach ór. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the National Library of Scotland and this talk. My name is Annette Hagan, and I am a rare books curator. This talk will take about 20 minutes. There is a questions facility at the bottom of your screen, so type in your questions anytime at all, and I'll try to answer them at the end of the talk. I'll now share a presentation with you. Just give me a second. Oh, yeah, not very good at this. Share screen. And this. Share. Slideshow. I think this is us in business. 1 second. So, I would like to take you on a whistle-stop tour of Gaelic printing. Since my remit for Gaelic stops in 1900, everybody I'm going to talk about was around between the 16th and the 19th centuries. Doesn't sound thrilling? Wait and see. What is Gaelic printing anyway? As far as the National Library's collections are concerned, we define it as any texts in Irish or Scots Gaelic printed in Scotland, and Scots Gaelic texts printed anywhere in the world. So books in classical Irish are in if they were produced in Scotland. They are easy to identify because they are written in the Roman alphabet. The Irish script was never used for printing in Scotland. Let's start in the mid-18th century with a writer who set 2 landmarks in the history of Gaelic printing. Then I'll take you back to where it all started, and I'll end with a 19th century favourite. Since all of our out-of-copyright Gaelic items have been digitized, you'll see images of the books as I'm talking about them, and you can, of course, read the complete books online for free anytime it suits you. So here we go. Up until 1741, every single Gaelic book printed in Scotland was of a religious nature. Then along comes Alexander MacDonald, Alistair Mcpherson Alistair. He's in his early 40s, has fought for the Jacobites at the Battle of Sheriffmuir, attended Glasgow University, and adhered to Episcopalianism until the death of his father, Meister Alistair, who was an Episcopalian minister. He then becomes a Presbyterian, and the SSPCK, the Society in Scotland for Propagating Christian Knowledge, appoints him a schoolmaster and catechist in Ashton-Burchan. They commission him to produce a Gaelic English dictionary for use in their charity schools, with a long-term aim of eradicating Gaelic through proficiency in English. This is one of the landmarks of Gaelic printing I mentioned, the first non-religious printed book, the 1741 Nior a Hegesk Enemenen, no a Nuor Ochler Gaelic Experara, a Gaelic and English vocabulary. Having secretly become Catholic, Mcpherson Alistair deserts his school and joins the Jacobites for the 1745 Rising. Later, he works as a factor on the Clanrond estate and writes poetry. In 1751, his Asheri na Shaun Chanan Albanich, no a Nua Oranich Gaelach, The Resurrection of the Ancient Scottish Language, or the New Highland Songster, becomes the first book of Gaelic poetry to be printed in Scotland. 12 copies are known to have survived, and our copy appears to offer an explanation for this apparent rarity. An inscription at the front claims, and I quote, "Numerous copies of this collection were burnt by the hands of the common hangman in Edinburgh in 1752 by order of the government." An intriguing story. But thanks in particular to the scholar Ronald Black, we know that not a shred of contemporary evidence of the popular supporting this claim exists. Rather, The fact that few copies survive is, if anything, evidence of the popularity of the book. It was literally read to pieces. Poems come alive when read aloud, and they were recited and also sung at ceilidhs, and the copies surely wandered from hand to hand. It is also true that it doesn't survive in copies of an 18th century text is about average. So, Mcpherson Alistair's dictionary and his poems were the first two non-religious books printed in Gaelic. But what about the religious texts that heralded the start of Gaelic printing and remained its mainstay for nearly 200 years? The very first Gaelic book to be printed in Scotland was Forum na Nuirneach, the Forms of the Prayers, a translation of the Book of Common Order. It was published in 1567. The translation was done by Sean Carswell, John Carswell, Bishop of the Isles and supporter of Protestant policies. He was one of the highly educated clergy who was literate in both Classical Irish, also called Classical Gaelic or the Classical dialect, as well as in English. Only 3 copies of the book survive, all of them imperfect, and none of them at the National Library, so unfortunately I can't show you an image of it. But I can give you some background. In 1556, the Scottish reformer John Knox lived in Frankfurt in Germany, and there he wrote a directory for public worship in the Reformed Church, the Book of Common Order. In 1560, Scotland became Protestant, and in 1562, this Book of Common Order, also known as John Knox's Liturgy, was adopted for use in Scotland. And only 5 years later, it appeared in Gaelic translation. Let me add a bit of printing history too. The first books printed in Scotland are dated 1508. By 1567, when the Gaelic version of Knox's Liturgy appeared, a grand total of 75 works had been printed in Scotland. This was the 76th. Only Edinburgh and St Andrews had a printing press at all. And the most productive printer in the country, Robert Lecproig, also produced the Gaelic version of Knox's Liturgy. The language of this translation, as mentioned, is the refined and static classical dialect employed by the bards, the court poets in early modern Scotland. Carswell used it partly because of its prestige. The professional bards not only had to undergo lengthy training in bardic schools in order to become accomplished, they were also highly regarded as the custodians of the conservative social order of Gaelic society, the praises of whose chiefs they sang. But there was a more basic reason for Bishop Carswell's use of the classical dialect for his translation. It was the only written form of Gaelic available. And incidentally, this was also the first written language north of the Alps, apart from Latin. Carswell's lasting achievement was to provide an entirely new lexicon for Reformed worship in Gaelic. He was adamant that printing in Gaelic should only be for religious edification and not for spreading vain, hurtful, lying, earthly stories. And he was right for a long time to come. The second book printed in Gaelic, of which the National Library holds the sole witness, the only known copy, is a translation of John Calvin's Catechismus Ecclesiae Genevensis, his catechism for the Church in Geneva. The title page is no longer present, and the first heading, Ad Chimichel and Crave, about the Creed, is the title by which this translation is known. Because there is no title page, there is no imprint, and so we can't be 100% sure where, when, and by whom it was printed. But it is bound together in one volume with the English version of Calvin's Catechism, which does have its title page and imprint, and that was produced in 1631 by the Edinburgh printer John Reeton. The type or font used for this English translation is identical with that used for the Gaelic version, and we therefore assume that both came from the same press at the same time. So, By 1631, over 60 years had elapsed since the printing of the first book in Gaelic. Nearly 30 years would pass before the next one appeared, and this was another translation, this time of the first 50 metrical psalms. Done by the Synod of Argyll, it came out in 1659, and a complete Psalter another 35 years later, in 1694. However, 10 years earlier, a different translation of the Psalms by Robert Kirk, minister at Balchwydda, had been published. The two translations of the same original texts are only 10 years apart, but when you compare their title pages, you get a right good insight into the spelling variations in the end of the 17th century. Just look at the first word, psalma versus psalm. That's just the most obvious ones. Why was there no uniformity? Well, there was no standard spelling to start with, and of course both versions were translations from Hebrew, and thus they were both trying to invent the wheel, as it were. Robert Kirk, incidentally, had also supervised the transliteration of the Irish Bible by changing the text from the Irish script into the Roman alphabet. That was in 1690. And the fact that a straight transliteration was deemed sufficient is a clear indication that the literary Gaelic of Ireland and Scotland was mutually intelligible, even though the vernacular spoken versions had become distinctly different. And another wee fact about Robert Kirk, he also believed firmly in the fairies. So, before 1700, only 4 Gaelic texts were printed in Scotland, all of them translations of important religious books: Knox's Liturgy, Calvin's Catechism, and the Psalms. Everything a good Presbyterian needs, apart from the Bible, which followed in due course. The New Testament was translated first, straight from the original Greek. It came out in 1767. The Gaelic Old Testament appeared in 4 installments between 1783 and 1801, with the first complete Gaelic Bible only being published in 1807, and then in London by the British and Foreign Bible Society. The ability to read Gaelic was founded on the Bible, and there Scotland wasn't any different from most other countries. But this meant learning the classical dialect. After the failure of the 1745 Jacobite Rising and the destruction of the strict social order of Gaelic society, the classical bardic tradition came to an end. What's the use of panegyric if there's nobody to praise? More to the point, if there is no patronage, who will pay the poet? Almost ironically, this decline became a catalyst for more literary diversity. Alistair Alistair's foray into poetry that praised nature, women, pets, the seasons, and the language itself, rather than clan chiefs, paved the way for more unofficial or folk poetry, if you like. In fact, the second half of the 18th century saw the widest variety of Gaelic verse of any century. Let me pick out the Argyll poet Duncan Ban MacIntyre, Donnacha Ban an Oran, or blonde-haired Duncan of the Songs, as he was fondly known. A poet of jollity and good company, he composed poetry from a young age, even though he was illiterate. Steeped in the oral tradition, he memorized his poems and eventually recited them to the Reverend Donald MacNichol, who wrote them down for publication. The National Library holds copies of all editions of Duncan Ban's poetry, including the first of 1768. His most famous poem is arguably Mola Bendoran, in praise of Bendoran, a nature poem of some 550 lines praising the mountains, deer, and hunting. The 18th century was also a high point for broadsides, like this intriguing slip song entitled An Chedagan Beg Grianar, the little humorous jewel box. Printed ostensibly in 1777, in Ballinamfiasken, that's Musselburgh, not exactly a Gaelic-speaking town. It is ascribed to Dún Uasalarich, a strange gentleman, and the imprint tells us that it is to be sold by yellow-haired Katrina and the old fiddler on every trip in the Highlands and from Mull of Kintyre to John O'Groats. Not only that, but it's to be had for threepence from girls and 2 shillings from boys. Somebody clearly had fun with this. The 18th century also saw a surge of Gaelic religious poetry, in particular in the wake of the evangelical revival. After the shattering of Gaelic society, many experienced a radical conversion to an austere and passionate evangelical faith. They were known as the Döge, the men, meaning the laymen and clergy drawn from the lower classes. The foremost poet of the evangelical revival was Dúil Buchanan from Balchwita. He assisted with the translation of the New Testament into Gaelic, and in 1767 he published his own poetry, Leu Spirital, Spiritual Hymn. Our earliest copy dates from 1773, and this is worn and mutilated through heavy use. Our copy of the second edition, Cochrún Yichach the Leu Spirital, Collection of Spiritual Hymns, published posthumously in 1784, has fared a little better. Buchanan's poems remained in print at least until 1913. They were read widely at home, abroad, and even World War I soldiers took copies to the battlefield with them for solace. They were also set and sung to traditional secular melodies, making them so much more memorable. Gaelic prose publications also began to increase from the mid-18th century. The earlier religious translations had helped rediscover Gaelic prose literacy and to transform it slowly from the classical dialect into a more vernacular variety. By the first half of the 19th century, Gaelic secular prose had fully developed. It was not only used for historical and supernatural tales or heroic legends, but for all purposes. In 1848, an issue of the periodical Fertaich nam Piaun, the Mountain Visitor, for instance, carried an article about the progress of the Asian cholera through Scotland. The same issue also has a biographical sketch of Dúil Buchanan and an account of the inhabitants of Pitcairn Island, among other articles. Indeed, the Gaelic periodical press and newspapers played a crucial part in the development of the new vernacular register of Gaelic. The earliest periodical of which copies survive, Antiachtar Gaelach, the Gaelic Courier, was published in 1829. Religious journals like the Free Church's publication Anianish, the Witness, were also very popular. A particular feature of the periodicals was the substantial body of dialogues they carried, up to about 300 have been counted. And of course, these journals were not only popular with Gaelic speakers in Scotland, but also with an increasing number of emigrants from the Highlands and Islands in the diaspora. Indeed, of the 16 periodical titles published in the 19th century, 4 appeared in Canada, in Nova Scotia, and 1 in Australia. The 19th century also saw a proliferation of anthologies, for instance, collections of proverbs, and also cheap print products like chapbooks. Chapbooks formed the stable reading diet of the common people right across Britain and Ireland. Some 15 Gaelic chapbooks are known to survive. Love songs were a particular favourite, as were laments, anything that could be performed and thus shared. Oops, sorry, ahead of myself here. The increase of Gaelic publications in the 19th century also brought some earlier poets into print. The famous 17th century Harris poetess, Mary MacLeod, Marini and Alistair Rua, finally had some of her work published, for instance in a chapbook. 2 poems of the 17th century Keppoch poet Ian Laum appeared in 1821, as slip songs, and now the verse of the 18th century Sutherland poet Robert Mackay, Rob Down, a vivid observer of Gaelic society, finally appeared in print, half a century after his death. The proliferation of Gaelic printing in the 19th century took place while no liberal education in Gaelic was possible, and therefore literacy in Gaelic was often self-taught. I'd like to end this talk now with one of the most famous 19th century Gaelic figures, the Skye poetess Mary Mcpherson, Mary Bone an Oran, great Mary of the songs. At the age of 51, she was incarcerated on a wrong charge of theft, and in prison she found her poetic voice. In her poetry, she expressed her outrage at her false imprisonment, and after her release, she composed Gaelic verse, often in support of political causes, such as the Land League. Song was, and still was at the end of the 19th century, an important channel for the dissemination of news and information, in particular for those illiterate in Gaelic. Indeed, Mary Bone an Oran herself was not fully literate. She could read Gaelic, but she couldn't write it. Her collection of songs, first published in Inverness in 1891, with a bilingual title, Poems and Songs by Mary Mcpherson, Dan agus Oran Gaelic, was transcribed from her recitation. And with Mary Bone's famous poem, Nura Miog, our whistle-stop tour of printing in Gaelic ends. More and thank you very much for listening.